Hello, my name is Bryson Murphy. I'm doing my presentation on the bombing of Dresden. Can you guess what world event happened in World War II involving the dropping of nearly 3,730 tons of bombs by the Allied forces on a civilian city in Germany? If you guessed the bombing of Dresden, you got it right. The bombing of Dresden is one of the most gruesome and important events in World War II, and yet it's almost never talked about. You may have heard about it as the setting of the book Slaughterhouse-Five, but beyond that, I'm sure many of you will be blown away by the interesting event. In this speech, I'll be going over the bombing of Dresden, including the city's history, the bombing itself, and the rebuilding process. Now to my first point, Dresden before the bombing. Dresden was founded in 1216 by Duke Albert. Dresden was bombed because they were a key transport junction for Germany in Churchill's eyes, so he wanted to bomb them as revenge for an attack the Germans did on one of his main cities. And that's what made Dresden such a strategic target. Some say that the bombing of Dresden was a war crime and didn't need to happen, but both American and British leaders say it was necessary with the way the war was going. The reason Dresden was bombed was because they were a large city and they didn't have any anti-aircraft weapons. The city was a major industrial and transportation hub. Dozens of factories provided munitions, aircraft parts, and other supplies for the Nazi war effort. Troops, tanks, and artillery traveled through Dresden by train and by road. Hundreds of thousands of German refugees fleeing the fight also arrived in the city. No one knows how many people in Dresden. The estimated population was 350,000, but it's a very rough estimate due to how many refugees were in the city at the time. It could have been much higher or a little bit lower. Now, let's get to the real interesting part, the bombing itself. The bombing itself happened on February 13th through February 15th in 1945. The casualties are estimated about 25,000 to 35,000, but they could have been upwards of 50,000. With how many unknown refugees there were in the city. How many bombs were dropped? On the first day, 800 bombers went on the air raid, dropping 2,700 tons of bombs. The second day was 400 tons of bombs, and the third day was about 630 tons of bombs. The total equals about 3,730 tons of bombs dropped on Dresden throughout those 3 days. Here's a quote by Kurt Vonnegut from 1969. He served in the war, and this is what he had to say about this event. The sun had just gone down, and its afterglow was backlighting the city, which formed low cliffs around the bucolic void to the idle stockyards. The city was blacked out because bombers might come. So Billy didn't get to see Dresden do one of the most cheerful things a city is capable of doing when the sun goes down, which is to wink its lights on one by one. That's from Kurt Vonnegut's book, Slaughterhouse-Five. American author Kurt Vonnegut, who lived 1922 to 2007, was a prisoner of war in Dresden during the Allied attack and talked about his experience in the bombing of Dresden throughout his book, Slaughterhouse-Five. He has another quote about Dresden saying, "It looked a lot like Dayton, Ohio. More open spaces than Dayton has. There must be tons of human bone meal on the ground." That's from Kurt Vonnegut in 1969. Since the event, Dresden has been able to rebuild and get back on its feet. Dresden after the bombing. A handful of historical buildings, the Zwinger Palace, the Dresden State Opera House, and several fine churches were carefully reconstructed out of the rubble, but the rest of the city was rebuilt with plain modern buildings. Since German reunification in 1990, Dresden has again become a cultural, educational, and political center in Germany. The Dresden University of Technology is one of the 10 largest universities in Germany and part of the German Universities Excellence Initiative. The economy of Dresden and its agglomeration is one of the most dynamic in Germany. Now let's talk about what this speech has been about. In this speech, I've given you the history of Dresden, the horrific bombings, and the rebuilding process. Dresden is now whole once again after the devastating attack in 1945. Dresden started out as such a cultural city, a lot similar to Lawrence, Kansas. They had a lot of arts, and it was a really nice city and really wasn't that important in the war. And it was brutally attacked and bombed as a tactical revenge from the Allied forces. Dresden is now whole once again after the devastating attack, and has restored much of its beautiful heritage. So, now you have learned about this horrific event. I know you will remember this obscure but wildly fascinating moment in history. Now, let's look through some pictures of Dresden. This is Dresden before the bombing. As you can see, it's a beautiful city and had a lot of really interesting buildings and great artwork in its architecture. This is a picture above of the bombings of Dresden. All the lights in that picture are bombs being dropped on Dresden. This is a picture right after the bombing, when the bodies were piled high onto carts that they got from the rubble from Dresden. And this is what Dresden looks like now. As you can see, it looks a lot like it used to, and it's been restored quite well and still looks very beautiful today. All right, thank you for listening.